Hello everybody, welcome to the final week, if you can believe it, of English 495 horror literature and film. Our final week, so this is the second to last, the penultimate lecture. And this is on 1990s horror, and this is something that the hopefully the younger and older members of the class, we can all hopefully recall somewhat well the 1990s and what was going on during the 1990s. And the Mark Edmondson essay that we read for today really takes us up until essentially the contemporary moment. The final lecture will talk about something that is of pressing concern, I believe, to people who study the genre right now. But the 90s is the closest thing to a study of the contemporary moment that we have currently. So, I want to trace out Mark Edmondson's argument a little bit, follow and see where he draws his conclusions from, what he is trying to tell us. I think this is one of those moments where we might pause and consider exactly where we have come from the beginning to the end, and ask some of those big picture questions of why it's important for us to continue to think about horror, and how has horror changed? Is it moving in a direction that we should feel positive about? Or is it headed in the wrong direction, somewhere that we would like to pull it back from? Those are big picture items, because nobody can argue that something like Paranormal Activity or some of the more the gory horror films of today are not a quite distinct departure from something like The Castle of Otranto. That's not to say there are not still similarities and threads that run all the way through. So I'd be interested to hear some of the similarities that you find. But the big question is horror today better or worse, or different, the same? How are we supposed to contextualize it in a larger arc of history for the genre? Edmondson believes that the 1990s, the watershed moment, he calls it, is the release of Silence of the Lambs in 1991, starring Anthony Hopkins as the infamous Hannibal Lecter. So some of you may have seen the film. Most of you will know the character of Hannibal Lecter has become extremely famous and an icon in American pop culture. This is a watershed moment, Edmund says, because it seems to mark a clear break from the horror that we talked about in the 1980s. If you can remember back to last week's discussion of the 1980s and the Tony Williamson piece, something happens between the 80s and the 90s, and he sees Silence of the Lambs as a clear dividing line. In the 1990s, horror would go from the kind of B movies of the 80s, the Halloween, the slasher films. Those are usually low budget. Some of them, most, are straight to VHS at the time, and so, hopefully most of you know VHS, a cassette, not a disc. Times have changed. So after Silence of the Lambs, horror becomes, Edmondson will contend, more mainstream. There will be a movement to include artistic horror films, almost a callback to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, mostly because Anthony Hopkins will be nominated for an Academy Award, and suddenly there's this prestige, this buzz, this profitability attached to high-minded horror. The result is a kind of plethora of examples of horror films that would take a highbrow approach to horror, starring big names, big budgets, and tackling very serious and consequential kinds of subject matter. And there's a whole list of those, Interview with a Vampire, others like it. There are lots of films that fit into this category in the 1990s. But more up our alley is the watershed moment indicates a kind of deluge or a flood of the Gothic into the mainstream, not just in the films, but Edmondson will say, in our entire world, in every form, every media, the Gothic predecessors will come roaring back and find a way to leak into and saturate into every nook and cranny of our everyday life. One example he's going to use is the O.J. Simpson trial. He will argue that there's a kind of Castle of Otranto oscillation going on here where O.J. Simpson will become like Manfred. To some, he will be a monster, a kind of primitive beast, and note there are these racial undertones to the discussion. But he will become the unbridled, passionate side, unrestrained by reason. On the other side, he will be, some groups will find him to be a victim, the maiden of the situation, the one who is being chased and pursued by a wicked and overly passionate justice system. So, within this character of O.J. Simpson, we have a clear Gothic scenario developing, and the whole trial, Edmondson says, takes on this kind of Gothic narrative, where, in truth, there are these kind of free-floating anxieties of the time involving race, violence, safety, miscegenation, all of these different anxieties that are free-floating become, in typical Gothic fashion, solidified within the narrative of the O.J. Simpson trial. So that's going to play a kind of pivotal role. And I want to argue, at this particular juncture, in the midst, or in the aftermath, I should say, of the George Zimmerman trial, that trial played out in very similar ways, in a very kind of Gothic fashion. So, Edmondson exhaustively moves us through the 1990s to find a number of different trials and situations, beginning with Michael Jackson. Hopefully all of you will know Michael Jackson and the numerous trials that he was involved in, the Unabomber, the whole string of bombers and serial killers in the 1990s, which will really set a precedent. We tend to believe that September 11th really broke the mold and created something totally new, but in fact these narratives had been practiced, rehearsed by the media even earlier. The AIDS epidemic would take clear, almost hearkening back to Dracula, the fear of the blood, and the way it was described, and the kind of monstrosities that were being feared and projected out onto this virus. So all of the discourse, all of the language surrounding AIDS takes on a kind of Gothic dimension. Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding, this was a very notable story in the 1990s. Tonya Harding, more of kind of an oddball, lower social status. Nancy Kerrigan, the kind of all-American princess character. Tonya Harding has Nancy Kerrigan attacked or beaten. And the trial and the subsequent debate is very much plays out almost like a Lovecraft story. Tonya Harding becomes the kind of non-traditional, anti-establishment, rural, uneducated, eccentric, monstrous character, the foil for which is Nancy Kerrigan, who is the kind of repressed princess who doesn't see the dark side until it kind of returns to get her. So that all of these stories in the 1990s were fueled by, Edmondson will say, by a Gothic angst, dating back to Silence of the Lambs, which will make everything more and more Gothicized. That's not to say that the Gothic started all of these different news stories alone, that there aren't other factors involved here, but it plays a very prominent role. It is the emotional response, the use of fear in particular, that will become a part of our daily life in a way that it never was prior to the end of the 20th century, a way that it is everywhere we turn. There is the fear of the darkness of what is being repressed returning, and all of these other ideas. So they've left the pages of a certain aisle of Barnes and Noble and become a part of the 24-hour news cycles that we know and love today. Okay, so the media uses all of these Gothic tropes to sensationalize everything. Everything becomes overly dramatic, but also everything becomes the story of a monster, of our collective unconscious coming back or boiling back to the surface in all of these various permutations, school shootings, violence on the streets, all of these things. Here's the issue. What is wrong with using these Gothic tropes in this manner? Well, Edmonds is going to say it isn't factual, and when you look at the data, America during this time becomes safer, actually, more stable, more financially stable, but also just generally the streets, crime rates drop, things tend to be on a positive trajectory. But against that reality, we have the narrative of things getting worse and worse, the doom and gloom forecasting. So, sensationalizing everything and placing everything into the frame of the Gothic. So what's the difference between, what's the result? We have Gothic now today as it stands, the 1990s moving into today. Compared to today's Gothic, compared to yesterday's Gothic, what are we to take away from it? Edmondson sees the oversaturation, the endless proliferation of Gothic tropes into our everyday life as a very negative thing. He thinks in some ways it has destroyed us and the genre simultaneously. Why? Well, in the 18th century and into the 19th century, he's going to write, quote, "The best terror Gothic woke its 18th century readers up." So if you take something like the Castle of Otranto, I would argue even 19th century things like Frankenstein and Dracula, what they did was woke us up. They woke the readers of that time up to certain injustices, exposed them to certain things that could not be known, to shake them out of their complacency. If you think to the Castle of Otranto and Frankenstein, the message is, be humble, you've become too confident in yourself. If it's to Dracula, be aware of the fact that industry and colonization have a negative or a dark underside. So be aware of that. Think about it. Wake up. Don't just kind of let the world go without acting or being a part of it. So it has a kind of constructive bent in the early years. As we have seen, the Gothic serves to remind us of what we are afraid of, and in so doing exposes us to our own lack or our own insufficiencies. It might help us to improve. Once we've addressed these things that have returned from repression, we will say, maybe we're better for it. Maybe we're better for addressing those monsters rather than keeping them hidden. That's the early Gothic. The Gothic today, Edmondson says, gives it the title, the Dead End Gothic. And he writes, quote, It's highly unlikely that today's Gothic expands anyone's breadth of tolerance much more than does the carnival freak show. Accordingly, Edmondson is going to say that the dead-end Gothic actually brings us nowhere. It doesn't help to expand our tolerance. It doesn't help to expand our sense of belonging or our sense of knowledge about the world. In fact, it doesn't do anything really to improve us. Instead, really what happens is it simply exposes us to a carnival show. We get some physical stimulation. We get the kind of fear or the heart racing, sweaty brow, but does little more than that. So has it become simply for sensation only? It doesn't do us any good. That's what he's going to argue. So Gothic oscillation, the ambivalence that we've been exposed to, the narrative of change, is replaced with one of chaos only. That it doesn't actually lead us to anything. All we actually end up with is more despair. What happens when you are constantly overexposed or oversaturated with images of monsters and gloom and madness and darkness, and there's no longer any real social agenda, and it becomes simply one of spectacle only? That's the question. Is that how Gothic is today? Does it continue to startle us out of our complacency, or has it become something that is kind of a sideshow? Is it nothing but a carnival today? This is a question that I think we have to tackle. I'm not quite so sure that Edmondson is absolutely right, that there is no longer a social agenda attached to the Gothic, that we're scared for the sake of being scared only. I think there are contemporary horror films and horror literature that continues to try and shock us in a way that moves us in the right direction, that moves us towards being better people and a better country, and a better world for that matter. But Edmondson would disagree with me. We have a kind of disagreement here about this. And Edmondson has a point. There is something that we seriously have to step back and consider when looking at the landscape. Is it too much to have the Gothic on our 24-hour news cycles? Should the agenda of the news, like the Gothic, be one of making meaning rather than just demonstrating despair? Should the narrative become constructive again rather than just destructive? So these are questions that are interestingly pointed not only at the genre we have come to know and love this semester, but also pointed even further out at the way that we understand the world around us. These things are tied together, and if we can somehow bring them both to a place of constructive, forward-thinking movement, then maybe we can collectively start to use them in the way that they have been used previously, both the news and the Gothic. So I want to hear your thoughts on this. Where do you see the Gothic standing today? Do you agree with Edmondson about the dire straits of the media and of the Gothic? Or do you believe that the Gothic in our current moment actually does something still useful? Fill in the blanks. You tell me. We'll look forward to the final lecture on the Ring next time. And remember, the Ring is going to scare your pants off. So be ready. Be afraid. Watch it with the lights on. And we will talk about it next time.